This lecture is all about disturbance, succession and stability. So it's all the material that's in chapter 18 of your textbooks. So in terms of lecture themes, the main kind of overriding theme is disturbance. So we'll start by talking about what is disturbance, what are the major types of disturbance generally experienced by communities and ecosystems. Then we'll talk about how disturbance affects biodiversity. So are communities and ecosystems that experience high levels of disturbance more or less diverse? And we'll talk about intermediate disturbance hypothesis during that section. Then we'll talk about how biodiversity affects community stability. So are communities that contain many species more or less prone to change in the face of disturbance? And then we'll start talking about how communities proceed after a major disturbance event. So we'll talk about primary succession, which is the growth and the colonization of organisms on a completely pristine landscape. Then secondary succession, which is what happens after disturbance events that leave behind soil and substrate for growth. And then we'll talk about succession endpoints like climax communities. And finally, we'll talk about what some of the mechanisms behind succession might be. So disturbance is a pretty broad concept and difficult to define because it involves essentially a departure from average conditions. But average conditions might vary quite substantially. So for example, variations in weather that we naturally get here in Canada over the course of a year wouldn't be considered as disturbance. But extremes in climate that we get every so often, like maybe a drought or a really intense freeze, may well be. And a really useful, I think the best definition of disturbance I've read came from White and Pickett in 1985, who said any relative discrete event in time that disrupts an ecosystem, community or population structure and changes resources, substrate availability or the physical environment. So it's not a snappy definition, but there I think it's probably about as close to it as you can get. So there's a vast number of potential sources of disturbance that may vary in their frequency, intensity and scale. So very broadly, you might divide disturbance events into abiotic and biotic factors. So abiotic factors you see here might include floods, fires, drought events, or major weather events like hurricanes. So biotic factors might include large predation events or herbivory events, like this swarm of locusts on the left-hand side. Diseases, like for example this picture on the bottom shows an elm tree that's dying from Dutch elm disease that's spread by a boring beetle. And you can imagine how the death of a large tree like that might affect many of the species that live in the shade of that tree or in the tree itself. So the death of an individual like this can have a huge impact on communities and ecosystems. But a disease event like Dutch elm disease that killed virtually all individuals can obviously have a massive impact. Humans increasingly have a huge influence on our environment, and so anthropogenic factors are a major source of disturbance in many communities. So this picture on the right hand side shows the effects of large logging industry on forests here in Canada and obviously all over the world. So I just included this picture to illustrate that disturbance happens on a huge range of scales. So this boulder with all of its lichens and mosses growing on it represents a community in itself. So if someone was to rest their hand on this or step on this boulder, that would represent a significant disturbance event for that community. So disturbance might be anything from that to a drought event that affects an entire country or continent. And so disturbance can be significant on a huge range of different scales. Over the years, there's been a lot of ecological research that looks into how disturbance affects biodiversity. And one of the kind of standout theories that's come out of that research was from Joseph Connell in 1975, who coined intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So Connell proposed that high diversity in communities was the result of continually changing conditions. And he predicted that intermediate levels of disturbance would promote higher levels of diversity. So that's shown by this graph on the right-hand side. So essentially what he's saying is that at really high levels of disturbance, so if disturbance events are intense and frequent, then the community is limited to just those species that are able to colonize and complete their life cycle between those disturbance events. So generally quite small, R-selected species that are very quick reproducers and quick colonizers. And conversely, if disturbance is very low, so if disturbance events are infrequent and not intense, then at those low levels of disturbance, then the community is going to be dominated eventually by those species that are the best competitors. So essentially the climax species. So if you just imagine a forest of predominantly very large trees. So at intermediate levels of disturbance is where you're going to find a mixture of all those different organisms and species types. And so it's at these intermediate levels of disturbance where we find the highest levels of diversity. One really good case study for intermediate disturbance hypothesis is the relationship between disturbance and diversity in temperate grasslands. So one of the most kind of frequent sources of disturbance in these habitats is the burrowing of mammals, and in particular prairie dogs. So the burrows of prairie dogs are pretty huge. So they're 1 to 3 meters deep and roughly 15 meters long. So a burrow of that size means excavating 200 to 225 kilograms of soil. And that soil is left in mounds around the entrances of these burrows. So this is an example of one of those mounds, and that kind of exposed earth that results from this burrowing provides open niches and open habitat for different plant species to colonize. Wicker and Detling in 1988 conducted a study on the effects of burrowing by prairie dogs on plant diversity in South Dakota. And what this figure essentially shows is that much of this area of South Dakota is characterized by fairly homogeneous grasslands. But in these areas where prairie dogs are active, you get these kind of distinctive patches of vegetation. And this is what kind of flagged up to them that maybe the activity of prairie dogs was having an impact on plant diversity in this region. So what Wicker and Detling did was they divided the plants in the region into 3 kind of functional groups. So grasses, shrubs, and forbs. So forbs is a kind of broad term for herbaceous flowering plants that are neither grasses nor woody trees or shrubs. What they found was that the activity of prairie dogs affected these different functional groups of plants differently. So shrubs, as you can see from the graph, were completely unaffected by prairie dogs at any level of disturbance. And you can kind of picture that the prairie dogs are not going to really burrow in the roots of shrubs when there's so much grassland to focus on. The abundance of grasses generally declined as the intensity of prairie dog burrowing and activity increased, and so that's because it's generally grasslands that are being disrupted and destroyed by this activity. But the diversity of forb species increased quite a lot in the early stages of disturbance by prairie dogs. So this is because these prairie dogs are creating new habitats and untouched soil for these forbs to colonize and increase their diversity. And so what they found overall was that species diversity of the plants in these regions were highest at intermediate levels of prairie dog disturbance. So these prairie dogs provide a really good example of where intermediate disturbance hypothesis works. But experiments in other ecosystems and communities have shown that this is not actually very often the case. So Mackey and Curry in 2001 reviewed 100 of these kinds of experiments, so looking at the effects of disturbance on diversity. And those experiments showed that that predicted peak in diversity at intermediate levels of disturbance doesn't actually happen very often, so in less than 20% of those experiments. And Mackey and Curry also argue that there's kind of, as well as not being backed up empirically, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is actually kind of illogical in that Joseph Connell based the idea on weakened competition. So the idea that disturbance reduces the densities of species, and that weakens competition and allows more species to coexist in the same area. But actually what Mackey and Curry point out is that when you reduce species density, you also reduce the level of competition that's needed to exclude those species or drive some of those species extinct. So intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been receiving less and less support. Jeremy Fox at the University of Calgary actually described it as a zombie idea. So it's this idea of suggesting that the idea is dead, but that it somehow won't go away. And you might ask, if that's the case, why are we teaching it? Well, although like many models similar to this in science, although they might hold up not that often, they still, I think, remain, and I think most people would agree, useful tools for understanding processes by which natural systems work. For a few slides now, I'm just going to start talking about community stability, and ultimately we're going to talk about the relationship between biodiversity and community stability. So do more diverse communities have greater stability? So first of all, let's define what community stability is. It's really the persistence of a community or ecosystem in the face of disturbance. So that stability can take one of two forms really. The first is resistance. So that's the ability of a community or ecosystem to maintain structure or function in the face of disturbance. So if you imagine this kind of stand of palm trees on this slide, facing this enormous disturbance in the form of a hurricane, but the physiology of those trees and their morphology is designed to withstand these extreme forces. And so that's a really good example of a community resisting disturbance. The other kind of stability is resilience. So that's the ability of a community or ecosystem to bounce back after disturbance. So I think kind of the intertidal zone of a rocky shore is quite a good example of this. So these are habitats that are routinely exposed to high levels of disturbance with kind of wave activity. But we know from historical experiments that if we clear away areas of these communities, pretty quickly they'll bounce back and form a pretty similar, if not almost identical community again. So this is a good example of resilience. So the general thinking is that community stability increases with biodiversity. And this may not always hold true, but essentially the thinking behind this is that if you have, for example, a community dominated by one species, then one form of disturbance that species can't tolerate could potentially wipe out that entire community. So think about this, this field of grass before and after an extreme drought. But if the community is made up of more species, the probability is that some or most of those species might be able to tolerate the drought. And so this is called the insurance hypothesis, the idea that there's kind of functional redundancy in the community. And so there's a probability that some of those species will be able to tolerate any given disturbance. And this diagram kind of sums that insurance hypothesis up a little bit more succinctly. So you have three communities here, two made up of two different individual species, and then a community that is a combination of those two species. And then you have the response of those communities over 3 different years. So year 1 is an average year, year 2 is a very warm year, and year 3 is a very cold year. So you can see that during the warm year, the green species thrives, but the blue species doesn't do very well. During the cold year, the green species doesn't do very well, but the blue species thrives. If you look at the top community, there's a difference in the makeup of the two species depending on the climatic conditions, but the overall health and productivity of the community is the same across all years. So this sums up insurance hypothesis, that you have several species in a community, and so they're able to kind of between them tolerate disturbances of various different types. So for the rest of the lecture, we're going to talk about succession. So succession is the gradual change in plant and animal communities in an area following disturbance. And we can think of primary succession, which is succession on newly exposed geological substrates. So that might be after a glacier retreats, it leaves behind nothing but exposed rock, or after a volcano erupts, the lava creates completely new ground with no substrate on it. So this is where we get primary succession. Then we have secondary succession, which is succession that occurs following a disturbance that doesn't destroy soil. So maybe after a forest fire or after an area of forest has been cleared, that kind of thing. So after that initial disturbance, the first thing that we get is a pioneer community. So these are the plants that colonize an area within the first 20 years after glacial retreat. But that time period would be different depending on what kind of succession we're looking at. So some communities, succession might take just 10 years or so to reach a climax. Other communities, it could take thousands of years. So increasingly, we don't think of succession as having an endpoint, but classically, we've always thought of succession as leading towards what's called a climax community. So this is the late successional community that remains stable until disrupted by disturbance. So if you think of a forest of giant redwoods, this is a community that's dominated by an extremely competitive species. And so many other species are excluded from colonizing at that point, and the community remains relatively stable, and that's what we would call the climax community. In other kinds of settings, we might have what we call a disclimax community. So that's where the endpoint is a community that's maintained only through continual disturbances. So a grazed field would be a good example of a disclimax community, because the community remains stable over very many years, but it only remains that way in the face of this continued disturbance. So succession in some environments might be predictable, leading to a given climax community virtually all of the time. And alternatively, succession can be unpredictable, leading to one of a number of different alternative states, depending on the environmental conditions. A classic example of succession comes from William Rayner's work in Glacier Bay in Alaska. And so this is a huge glacier that is retreating and has been retreating over thousands of years. And as it retreats, it leaves behind exposed rock. And we can study the colonization and the development of plant communities on that exposed rock over time. So of course those plant communities change over periods of thousands of years, so too long a period of time for one scientist to study in their career. So the way that we can approach those studies is to use what's called a chronosequence. So this is where we use sites in Glacier Bay that we know have been deglaciated at various points in history, and so we can substitute space for time. So we can look at the plant communities in these different sites, and those different sites represent a different amount of time since the glacier retreated. So you can see 4 of the sites that Rayner used on this map in the middle of this figure, and he chose sites that were all less than 100 meters in elevation and all similar in terms of their physical features, and that's because he wanted to keep everything constant apart from time since glaciation, so to control for other factors. So you can see in the first site that was deglaciated only 30 years previously, there's a pioneer stage with fireweed, the dominant species. In his second site, which was 70 years post-glaciation, there's a drier stage, so kind of very shrub-like community. Then his third site, 120 years since glaciation, is dominated by alders. And then finally, that fourth site, 210 years since glaciation, is a mature or relatively mature spruce forest. So using this chronosequence, Rayner and his colleagues could map changes in the plant community over a period of nearly 2,000 years. And what they found was an increase in plant diversity, or quite a fast increase in plant diversity over the first 200 or so years, and then a slow kind of leveling out in diversification after that. What Rayner found as well, though, was that pattern of species diversity was different when you looked at different functional groups of plants. So basically things like tall trees, tall shrubs and mosses, liverworts and lichens all reached maximum diversity after about 100 years since glacial retreat. But low shrubs and herb species continued to increase in diversity through 1,500 years. So the patterns of diversification change quite dramatically across different functional groups of plants. So I'm going to talk now about an example of secondary succession, and I'm going to use for that example a South Florida habitat that I used to work in, the pine rocklands. So this is an example of a healthy pine rockland habitat. So it's characterized by this really open canopy of slash pine trees with lots of light reaching a really diverse herb layer where the huge majority of the plant diversity lies in this really low-lying shrub layer. Like many habitats in South Florida, the pine rocklands are fire maintained. So what will happen is every maybe 6 to 9 years, a fire will come through the habitat, removing all of that low-lying vegetation. And the fires tend to burn cool enough that they leave the large pine trees fairly undamaged. So what you have then is a kind of an existing substrate for plant species to recolonize. So this is an example of secondary succession. And what we get over a period of 6 to 9 years is many of those diverse species competing for space and colonizing those open niches. Unfortunately, what's happening in South Florida is that the pine rocklands are a very fragmented habitat, and those fragments, remaining fragments, are surrounded by dense human populations. And the human populations tend, for understandable reasons in many cases, to prevent these natural fires from occurring. People don't want fires near high traffic areas or near their homes. And so what happens is these fires are suppressed, and over time that really diverse herb layer starts to be dominated by fewer and fewer large species. So a few species of large palm trees and a few sometimes invasive trees start to dominate that area and shade out a lot of the diversity. So this might be a good example of where intermediate disturbance hypothesis actually rings true, because if the fires happen on a regular basis, maybe 6 to 9 year intervals, then we get this cycling of high diversity in the herb layer, and that might be seen as intermediate disturbance. If there's no disturbance, then the habitat starts to be dominated by fewer and fewer dominant species. So we know that over time after a disturbance event, we observe changes in species composition and species diversity. And these changes over time we term succession. But a big question that remains is, what are the mechanisms driving that succession? And for the rest of this lecture, we're going to try and address that question. So we'll start addressing this question by looking at two historical viewpoints. The first comes from Frederick Clements in about 1916. And he viewed succession as a very deterministic process. So groups of species would colonize in an area and would then facilitate a next group of species to colonize after those. So there'd be very little overlap in the species distributions within those waves. And ultimately this succession would lead to a climax community that Clements felt was almost entirely stable and would maintain itself indefinitely unless faced with another serious disturbance event. So Clements saw the community like a form of superorganism, and he saw succession as analogous to the development of that organism throughout its life. So in 1926, Henry Gleason came up with a very different approach or description of succession. And he argued that individual species distribute themselves completely independently of each other. So any overlap of species in communities comes about just as a result of coincidence. Gleason was also much less deterministic about succession. He felt that rather than succession leading almost inevitably to a similar climax community, he felt that the final climax of succession would depend on local conditions and random events. So many years later, in 1954, Frank Egler kind of clarified those two positions and put them into his own two descriptions. So the first was Clement's ideas he described as relay flouristics, and Gleason's ideas he described as initial flouristics. So in relay flouristics, waves of species are replaced or facilitate their replacement by another wave of species, and there's very little overlap in those species distributions at different successional stages. And in contrast to this, he described Gleason's ideas as initial flouristics, and this is where different species dominate at different time periods following disturbance, but there's a lot of overlap in species occurrence. So another way to put this is that basically all species could colonize immediately after disturbance, and what happens over time is just changes in which of those species dominate. So they're not waves of different species, it's just differences in which species dominate over time. So these two figures describe those ideas really nicely, I think. So the graphs have time in years on the x-axis and then species on the y-axis. So the figure on the left describes relay flouristics. So you can see you get an initial species or maybe a group of species like weeds that colonize the land immediately after disturbance. But those are replaced by subsequent waves of species until we get a climax. The figure on the right-hand side describes initial flouristics. So you can see what looks initially like a very similar process, but in fact, some of those tree species that form the climax community actually colonize the area very early on, but they exist in the community for many years as saplings before they rise to dominance. So with those models, Egler kind of formalized the ideas that had been put forward by Clements and Gleason many years previously. But the models were still pretty simplistic. And so those ideas were built upon years later by Joseph Connell and Ralph Slater, who came up with three models for succession: facilitation, tolerance, and inhibition. So we'll go over now what all of those three things were. Facilitation is the idea that many species might try to colonize newly open spaces after disturbance, but there are some species that are much better adapted for quickly colonizing those spaces, and those are pioneer species. And pioneer species will grow initially well, but then slowly modify the environment so that it becomes less suitable for them and more suitable for species from later successional stages. And so those species from later successional stages will slowly take over, and this will keep occurring until you reach a climax community that no longer facilitates colonization by other species. So a good example of this would be plants colonizing open spaces after a fire. So often the plants that are able to colonize first are plants with small seeds that can be distributed very easily and dispersed very widely. And those seeds germinate very quickly, but they have high light requirements. So that works for them very early, in early successional stages when the canopy has been removed by fire, let's say, and so there's abundant light. But as those pioneer plants grow, they create shade at ground level. And so at ground level, the conditions become less favourable for those plants and for their seeds to germinate, and much more favourable for more shade-tolerant species. And so it's those species that grow next and slowly take over from the pioneer species. So the second model proposed by Connell and Slater was tolerance. So this is much more similar to initial flouristics. So it's the idea that all of the species in the community can colonize very early. It's not limited to just those pioneer species to begin with. So even the species that become dominant in the climax community, so these large trees, can be present in the community right from the start. They're just present as smaller individuals that don't become dominant until later. So there's no facilitation in this model. All that happens is that as the community develops, the species that become more dominant are the ones that are more tolerant of the conditions that arise through the course of succession. And so a climax community is eventually established when all of the species that aren't tolerant of those conditions get excluded. And there are no more species that are tolerant of the environmental conditions that are being created that can colonize. So the third model proposed by Connell and Slater was inhibition. So in this model, any species can colonize the area during the early stages of succession. So not limited to pioneer species, so much more similar to the tolerance model than the facilitation model at this point. But in the inhibition model, early occupants of a community modify the environment to make it less suitable for basically any other species. So the early colonizers inhibit colonization by later arrivals. So this is a kind of first come, first serve model. So in this case, the climax community is usually made up of very long-lived species that are resistant to disturbance. So this figure does a really good job of summarizing those three different models, those three different theorized mechanisms for succession. So of course, in reality, the mechanisms driving succession are more complex than any of these simple models. But many experiments in natural settings have tended to support the facilitation model or the inhibition model or some combination of the two. Chapin and colleagues in 1994 used a combination of observations from the field as well as field experiments and greenhouse experiments to explore the mechanisms behind succession in Glacier Bay in Alaska. And the way they did that was they looked at the species that tends to make up the climax community, which are spruce and fir trees. And they explored the influences of 4 different successional stages on establishment and growth of those plants. So Chapin and colleagues looked to understand the mechanisms driving succession by focusing on one of the climax species in these Glacier Bay communities, the spruce trees. And they looked at how different successional stages affected germination and growth of spruce seedlings. So for example, in the pioneer phase of succession in this region, very few spruce seeds germinated, as you'd expect, with very little substrate, but those that did tended to survive in high numbers, but growth rates were relatively low or very low because there are very few nutrients available. As succession moves along and we get into the driest phase, there's a net inhibition of spruce seedlings. And that's because although there's an increase in substrate and available nitrogen, etc., that's offset by the massive increase in competition for space. So those spruce trees tend to be shaded out and very little germination of spruce seeds occurs at this phase. During the older phase of succession, that's the first time that Chapin actually saw a net facilitation of spruce trees. So although there's even greater competition for space and light during this phase, that's offset by the increase in soil organic matter, available nitrogen, and the activity for the first time of things like mycorrhizal fungi. During the final phase of succession, the spruce forests, there's actually a net inhibition of spruce seedlings. That's because despite increases in overall nutrient availability and organic matter, this is offset by greater competition for light, massive underground root competition for nutrients, And so at this stage, there's actually a net inhibition of further recruitment of spruce seedlings. All of this goes to show that the mechanisms driving succession are incredibly complicated and changeable over time. But despite all of this complication, things like, or models like tolerance, facilitation, and inhibition are still really useful categories for trying to understand the mechanisms behind succession. So I'm going to finish the lecture by describing a typical secondary succession example, that of boreal forests. So in boreal forests, what tends to happen during succession, or the general pattern, is that early hardwood species like aspen are slowly replaced by conifers like spruce and fir. And this pattern of succession is largely driven by the life history traits of those two species. So aspen have very small shade-intolerant seedlings. So after disturbance events like fire, they tend to colonize very quickly, and they're very adept at doing that. But over time, spruce and fir trees colonize much slower, but they start to grow up in the gaps between these aspen trees. And as for whatever reason, aspen trees die back, or there's small disturbance events that cause that, these spruce trees are there ready and waiting to take over. Once they do, light conditions at ground level are obviously very low, not suitable for aspen trees to regrow. And so what you end up with is a climax community very much dominated by spruce and fir trees. So you might expect that this would eventually lead to a kind of ultimately a homogeneous climax community of spruce and fir. But in fact, climax communities are by no means inevitable. The community ultimately is shaped by environmental conditions, so perhaps most importantly, the frequency of fire. So as a result, at the landscape scale, boreal forests are a patchwork of different communities.